How's it going, everyone? My name is Shizukira, and today we are going to be taking a look at one of unironically the strongest striker partners in the game at the moment, and that is Douglas. Now, it might sound like a bit of a joke for those who haven't been seeing the posts on Reddit and stuff, but genuinely, Douglas is one of the strongest partners that really a lot more people should be building at the moment, and we're going to take a look at why in this video. Now, before we get into it, here's how it's going to go. First, I'm going to give a TLDR for people who don't want to see all the nerdy math stuff that we're going to be looking at. After that, we are going to talk about partner utility between Douglas, Lilian, and Scarlet. After that, we're going to talk about Mei Lin and a little bit about Haru, Yuki, and Ritochika later on in the video. We'll then go over some rotations, comparing some different partners, and then we'll go over why we're seeing the numbers that we are. So it's going to be a bit of a long video today, but I didn't spend several days doing all of this for nothing, so feel free to put this on a second monitor and just have me be a voice in the background. So the TLDR, for those who don't want to go through the entire video and see all the numbers, the best option for Mei Lin specifically is going to be a P1 Scarlet. After that, it is going to be a P5 Douglas, and then after that is going to be a P5 Lilian. Now, there are a couple specific instances where Lilian at P5 will do a bit more damage than Douglas, but if your Lilian is P4 or lower, then it's just going to be a P5 Douglas no matter what. And this is pretty much a trend for a lot of the other strikers when we're talking about Yuki, when we're talking about Haru. Douglas is going to, at the very least, be better than the P5 4-star equivalent, but it's kind of neck and neck when it comes to some of the 5 stars. So while today we are going to talk specifically about Scarlet, I have seen some people say that Douglas actually outdamages Westmacott, and honestly, I wouldn't be too surprised if he outdamaged Asteria as well. But that's not what this video is going to be about. In this video, we're going to be taking more of a look at Mei Lin, and by extension, Scarlet and Lilian. So firstly, let's get utility out of the way, because one thing we're not going to talk about much when it comes to the numbers is the ego skills themselves. And there's a pretty good reason for it. So firstly, Lilian has no real utility, especially when we are talking about Mei Lin. And the reason for that is because her ability to draw an assigned combatant's attack card costing 1 or less just isn't what you want on Mei Lin pretty much at all, and the reason for that is you want a deck that already pulls the strike for you. You can't pull Dragonspire because, at least in this situation, we're taking the 2-cost version, and you can't pull Flame Dragon Sovereignty because, again, it is the 2-cost version. So since you'll be using Unity to pull your strike cards, having Lilian pull 1 extra strike just isn't really going to be providing you with much more damage at all. On top of that, being an ego skill, you're only going to actually cast this once in a battle at most, if you even do that. And the only other thing it brings is 100% damage to all enemies, which is outclassed by Douglas, who does 120% to all enemies for 1 less cost. So what you're getting from Lilian in terms of utility is pretty much non-existent over Douglas. And then for Scarlet, this is actually going to be a much more significant buff. This does only apply for 1 turn, so in longer fights, you're going to find that the bonus damage you got on that 1 turn doesn't contribute as much to your overall damage as it would in a shorter fight. So if you're doing something like Basin, this is definitely going to have a lot more impact, but if you're taking a long time to do something like a 9/9 Kentress, then you are going to start to see slightly diminishing returns on the utility from Scarlet, but this is going to be better than what Douglas provides, no doubt about it. Though, as you'll see when we get to the numbers, the amount of utility that is provided isn't really going to matter, but we'll get to that shortly. So taking a look at the Mei Lin deck, this is the one that we are going to be running when it comes to all the testing that you're going to see. The only difference is that for Jewel, we are going to be looking at the 20% version rather than the 30% version. But in terms of the damage output, it's going to be the exact same thing. So if you're wondering why there is a 20% multiplier on some things instead of a 30% multiplier, it's just because we're using a different version of this card. But again, when it comes to damage testing, it is the same one that we're using across every single rotation. So since we are still keeping the numbers consistent, it still works for the sake of comparison. And speaking of rotations, this is what we're going to be looking at today. Now, there is a ton of numbers on the screen, but don't worry, I'm going to explain them in a way that hopefully makes as much sense as possible. You do not need to know anything that is going on here. I will talk about it, but you don't need to understand the ins and outs of what's going on. Don't worry about all the different numbers and all the different decimals. I'm just going to give you guys the important information that you would want to know when picking which partner is going to be better. So first, let's actually talk here about what we're comparing. So we have two different rotations we're looking at, and we're going to be looking at, of course, a P5 Douglas, a P5 Lilian, and a P1 Scarlet. Now, the first rotation is going to be a short rotation that is much more consistent to actually pull off on a turn-by-turn basis, and the second rotation is a much longer one, which is an ideal situation, but not something you can really play every single turn. Now, these numbers up here on these 6 tables isn't as important as these 6 at the bottom. We will get to what the difference is in just a moment. But regarding these ones at the top, this is characters that have some benefits. So we have some attack percent from the substats. We, of course, have a partner equipped, but we're not talking about any gear. We're not talking about any memory fragment sets or any of that stuff. So these are just raw low numbers, which most people are not going to be getting. You will likely be getting much higher than this. But I also wanted to work these out because I wanted to show, firstly, the difference between a low amount of gear and a high amount of gear, but also to give you guys an example of why you need to look at things in a much wider perspective and you can't just look at things from one angle. But again, you'll see that when we talk more about the numbers. So as you can see here, the short rotation is going to be using Jewel, which is going to increase our damage by 20%. Again, there is a 30% variant that you can use, but we're using the 20 here. After that, we will be using Spirit of the Aramata. So this one is going to give us a stacking 20% additive bonus for every Mei Lin card that we play. After that, we will be playing Unity and playing out both the strikes that it pulls. We'll then be playing another Unity, both the strikes that one pulls, and then finishing it off with a Spire, which in this short rotation is going to have 9 hits. Now, the reason I've put Jewel before Aramata and not afterwards is because more than likely you are going to play Jewel on a separate turn since it is an upgrade that lasts the entire fight. If I expected people to be playing Jewel after Aramata, then that would make the hand much harder to acquire, so a more realistic thing is that Jewel comes before it. And even in the extended one, I've also put Jewel coming before Aramata, but in a perfect world, you would play these the other way around. And the reason for that is just so you can get the benefit from Aramata when you play Jewel as well. And speaking of the extended combo, the only difference here on this version is that we are going to play 2 strikes before we play our first Unity, and we are also going to include a Sovereignty right before our Spire at the end. This is going to change when we look at the geared version down here, where we only play 1 strike in the long combo. The reason we're only playing 1 is because of how move works in the game. So there are some effects that proc when you draw a card. Now, move does count as draw if you pull from the deck, but it doesn't count if you pull from the graveyard or the discard. So because of that, if we had 2 strikes in our hand and then we played Unity, we'd be pulling them both from the graveyard, which means we wouldn't be able to proc on draw effects, which is going to be really important. So because of that, in the geared version, we only play 1 strike before Unity, because ideally we would have our second strike still in the deck so that Unity can pull it and proc the draw effect. Now, some people might be wondering where all these numbers are coming from. In the last video I made where I was comparing Westmacott and Lilian, I showed there how we were getting these numbers, and I also showed footage in-game of me showing that yes, the numbers that are showing up here are the same numbers I'm getting there. So if you want to see the proof for how that works, that will be in the previous video. I'll link it up in the top and in the description. And maybe at some point in the future, I'll do a video dedicated to how the whole thing works and just kind of a proof video for if anyone ever asks. But for now, that is in the last video if you want to go and take a look at that. With that said, let's finally start looking at the comparison between these different partners. So in the second column for all these partners, this is the individual damage that each card is doing. So if we take a look at Scarlet, the first strike is hitting for rounding up to 378 damage, the second is hitting for 419, on, and on the right is a total of how much damage you are doing in that turn. So if you cycle through these cards with the different stats that we have here, which by the way, we're not looking at elemental advantage here, and we're not looking at hitting crits or anything, then this rotation is putting out nearly 8,000 damage. And in fact, all of these are putting up 7,500 to 8,000 roughly. And what you're going to notice here is that the P1 Scarlet is putting out quite a bit more damage than Douglas is, which is also more than Lilian. Not by a crazy amount, we're only talking about 60 damage, but it is going to be more. Now, an interesting thing to note is that, especially when we look at ungeared versions, these percentages here are comparing the individual damage of Lilian to the individual damage of Douglas. And you can see that Lilian has actually more damage on all her cards until we get to Spire. And that is a big one that we are going to talk about. Spire is a very, very important card. And the reason for that is because Lilian doesn't buff that with her 1 cost passive, well, 1 cost and 0 cost passive, but also because Spire has a higher multiplier. Now, towards the end of the video, when we talk about why we're seeing the numbers we do, we will talk more about card multipliers and why Spire is such an important card. But for now, just know that Spire is going to be the card that puts Douglas above Lilian, especially when we're talking about having, in this case, literally no gear. And then when we take a look over at Scarlet here, you can see that compared to Douglas, she does start to fall off a little bit and their damage gets a little bit closer together. But even when you're using Spire, it's still not going to be enough for Douglas to take over. So Scarlet is still going to be better, but in this case, only by 3%, which really is not much. Then when we take a look at the longer combo here, again, you can see that Lilian is beating out Douglas until we get to Sovereignty and Spire, at which point Douglas starts to do more damage, and he is going to fall behind by about 5 damage in this longer ungeared rotation, but trust me, that's not going to matter, and we will get to that. Another thing to note is because the rotation's getting longer, Scarlet is also falling off a little bit and is barely better than Douglas by not even 1%, but it is still enough to beat out Lilian. Now let's talk about more realistic numbers that you're going to see. So the difference down here is that firstly, we have elemental advantage, so we're attacking a passion weak enemy. Secondly, we have 180% crit damage, and we're also going to be running Eye of the Eyeless and Chimera Knight. So I'll put those on screen now so you can see what those do. And that is going to change things a little bit, especially in Douglas's favor. So when we look here, again, you can see that Lilian is going to be out damaging Douglas in the strike department, not by as much as the ungeared one, but it is still a little bit more damage. And again, when we get to Spire, it's much less, and even this strike ends up being less. And because of that, she's only doing about 97% of the damage that Douglas is by the end of the combo. You can see over here that he's doing nearly 600 more in the short version. And then when we take a look over here at Scarlet, again, she is going to do more damage than Douglas, but by about 1.6%, it's nothing crazy. And she is consistently going to put out higher numbers, but again, not by a huge amount. And then lastly, we come over to take a look at the extended combos for these. And again, Douglas is going to be beating out Lilian, especially when it comes to Sovereignty and Spire. And while the gap does close a little bit, it's still not enough. He's going to be up by over 300 damage in this situation. And then we take a look at Scarlet, and once again, yes, she is doing more damage, but barely. We are talking 0.65% more than Douglas, which really isn't much. It's even less when you're getting into these longer combos. And there is one point where Douglas does a bit more damage, but either way, she is still going to be better than Douglas overall. And so what we can see from all these different charts is that, yes, consistently, a P1 Scarlet will outdamage a Douglas by just a tiny amount. Honestly, not enough to consider pulling her, unless you really, really like Scarlet, or you really, really like Mei Lin or something. Sure, if you want to pull for Scarlet, pull for Scarlet. But if you're just going for damage and you just want to get the best things you can, there is definitely better places to invest your pulls than going for a Scarlet, because the damage increase is so minuscule that if you are struggling to do something, it is more so going to be because of your deck and not because of the fact you are using a Scarlet or not using a Scarlet. So over here, I kind of want to explain why we're seeing the differences that we are between Douglas and Lilian, and also just talking about what it is that's making Douglas so strong. So to briefly explain how the whole calculation here works, this upper line here is calculating the attack stat for your character. And this will be different from what you see in the character screen when you are in the menus. And that's because some things aren't taken into account until you go into the battle. And that includes things like the flat equipment bonus and the partner percent bonus. These will not show up on the character screen. You will need to go into a battle to be able to see this. And then the second line here is going to be calculating the percent value that is on the card when you go to do damage. So over here, we have like the base value, which is with no potentials, no buffs, no nothing. And then we add in the potentials, we add in the benefits, as well as a few other things. And that's going to give us our final card percent. And then these two numbers are multiplied together with a few other things to give us the expected damage. So I've gone ahead and made these the same now. So this middle one is for Lilian, this top one is for Douglas. Ignore this bottom one. It's for Scarlet, but we are not going to talk about Scarlet right now. We are just going to talk about Douglas and Lilian. So when all the numbers are the same, the only difference is Douglas has less flat attack because he is a 3-star partner compared to Lilian, who is a 4-star partner. And for the record, these are the level 50 versions, not the level 60 ones, so these can go a little bit higher. And the other difference is that Douglas gives the 16% passive attack boost, and that's really, really important. It is an attack boost, and Lilian does not have this. So you can see here, even with the same final card multiplier, Douglas is going to be putting out a decent bit more damage. And again, that's coming from the fact that his attack stat is higher than Lilian's because of this passive. Now, over here, where we have Douglas versus Lilian, what this is showing is that Douglas's damage compared to Lilian's is 113%, 0.13. So in other words, he has about 13% more attack than Lilian does. And the reason it's not 16 is because there's other numbers that go into it. This is not the only one, so it's never going to be 16% exactly. And then this EQ here is what Lilian would need as a card multiplier to put out the same damage as Douglas. So let's pretend that this is how much her card was going to be doing. Then you can see here, we have the exact same expected damage. So when Lilian and Douglas have the same final card percent, Douglas will always do more damage because of his attack, whereas Lilian will need to make up a 13% deficit to make up for her lack of damage. Now, theoretically, the way Lilian does this is through her passive. So let's say we have a P5 Lilian and you play a Shrike, which is a 1-cost card. Well, that's going to give her a 20% additive bonus that Douglas doesn't have. And you can see now she has a higher expected damage because her final card multiplier is more than 149. She is making up for that 13% difference and a little extra. Now, the issue with Lilian is when we start to talk about higher card bases and higher card multipliers because she is completely additive. So down here, I'll explain a little bit about what that means. The issue with an additive bonus is it gets drowned out, it gets diluted. So let's say you have a card that is doing 200% damage, but you get an additive 40% bonus. Well, now it does 240, you've increased your damage by 20%, or at least you've increased your multiplier by 20%. That's all great. Let's say though you have 600 on your card, and then you add 40. Because it's still only 40, you're only increasing the card now by not even 7%. Because it is an additive bonus. So as the number gets bigger, the amount you're adding to it actually increases your damage by a lot less. Now, if we take a look at a situation here where you have the same 600, but now you multiply it by 40%, and you can see here there's the difference of 40%, this is going up to 840. And that's just because as a number gets bigger, multipliers don't lose their effectiveness, they actually gain effectiveness, and you don't really dilute multipliers nearly as much as you dilute additive numbers. A great example to see this actually in action is if we take a look at the extended combo for a geared P5 Douglas and P5 Lilian, we can take a look at sovereignty. Now, in these third columns, you can see the buff amount, and we can see here that in both cases, we have a 55% multiplier on both of the cards, but Lilian has a 300% additive buff, whereas Douglas only has a 240% additive buff. But Douglas is actually doing more damage on this card, and the reason why is because the additive bonus is so diluted that Lilian's not providing enough to overcome that 13% difference in attack that she needs to be ahead of Douglas. Another part of it is that sovereignty already has a 300% base card multiplier, which means this 55% is having a huge effect on the base card, which again is going to make it harder for Lilian to overcome the gap that she needs to if she wants to outdamage Douglas. When we take a look here, again, we have equalized all the numbers, except obviously the partner percent from Douglas and the flat partner from Lilian. We're taking a look here at a 300% base card multiplier. And you can see that for Lilian to overcome Douglas's final attack, she needs 421% on her final card, and we're only at 372. And as this gets higher, the gap also increases. If we take a look at something a bit more ridiculous, maybe something around 800, which is possible for some people, then by this point, we are needing to overcome over 100% final card multiplier to be able to outdamage a Douglas, and that is literally not possible because a max stack P5 Lilian only gives 80% additive, and you'd be hard pressed to find a card doing this much damage without a single multiplier or other additive source. And again, another thing to note is that we're talking about a P5 Lilian here, and a lot of people aren't even going to have P5. So this conversation of who's going to be doing more becomes even more irrelevant when we start looking at P4, P3, especially all the way down to P1 Lilian. And if you guys want to see an example of what P1 Lilian looks like, if we take a look at the biggest gap we ever see between Lilian and Douglas, it is an ungeared short combo on the first strike where we're seeing that she's doing about 12%, nearly 13% more damage than Douglas on this specific strike. So we're comparing Lilian with 120% additive, 20 multiplier, to Douglas on 60% additive, 20 multiplier. And here you can see those exact same numbers, 335 for Douglas, 378 for Lilian. But if this was a P1 Lilian, then in this situation, she currently has 2 stacks of her passive coming from Aramata and Unity, as well as the 20% coming from using a 1-cost card. So that is a total of 60% coming from Lilian. But if she was P1, it would only be 30%. So this 120 would only be 90, and even at peak difference between Lilian and Douglas, she outdamages him by not even 2 full points of damage. And that is the biggest the difference ever gets in any point of comparison between these two, geared and ungeared long combo and short combo. So again, when it comes to the Lilian Douglas debate, it really is a P5 Lilian before you can even consider it being stronger, and anything below P5 is just not going to be worth it. Just invest into your Douglas. Again, if you have P1 Scarlet, especially if you have a P2 Scarlet, yes, 100% run your P2 Scarlet. She's going to be significantly better, especially if you do play into her passive. But unless your Lilian is P5, you're going to be better off taking Douglas. Now, just a final note on Douglas as a partner for other characters. Of course, we have characters like Yuki, we have characters like Haru, and that's a big part of why I wanted to use Mei Lin as a comparison. Mei Lin consistently uses cards with a low base value of 100 because that's the base value of strike. But when we look at characters like Haru, you're looking at 320 plus 90, 280, 350. Even when we take a look at some of these other cards, 180, 270. These are way bigger multipliers than what you're seeing on Mei Lin, and because of that, that means Douglas is going to be doing a ton more damage on these characters. Again, we take a look at Yuki, even this base card here, 220% damage. We take a look at Flash, 270, 180, 320, 300. Really, really big values that Douglas is going to be able to capitalize off of, which other 4-stars struggle to do. This goes for Scarlet, and this goes for Ritochika as well. At the end of the day, Ritochika has an almost identical buff to Lilian, with the only difference being that you get 5% for a random card at the start of the turn. But again, this is an additive 5%. And when you're already adding 6, 7, 8 plus 100% to a card, what is plus 5% doing? If it was a 5% multiplier, maybe it's a little bit of a different conversation, but it's not. It's a plus 5% buff. It's not really going to do much when you're looking at really big card values. Now, people are going to like the 3 morale for 1 turn, and that's fine. If you want to use it for that, then you can. But Douglas is giving you a 16% buff. Obviously, it's 8 at base, but no one's using P1 Douglas. Everyone has P5 Douglas. So it is a 16% attack buff, which is going to be valuable for the entire fight. And also, we didn't even talk about the fact that you get 16% damage dealt at the start of turn 1. This is also a multiplier, but it's only for turn 1, so there wasn't really a need to talk about it. But yeah, if you're trying to do things like Basin and you want to be quick, well, your first turn might be your quickest turn. But with that all being said, hopefully you guys found this interesting. I tried to make it a little bit more educational because, again, I could just give the TLDR of Douglas is amazing. If you don't have Scarlet, use Douglas. But I want to be able to give you guys reasons for why I'm saying that something is better. I want to be able to break these things down and show you guys that these aren't just being made up. These aren't just like, oh, it feels like it's better. No, genuinely, Douglas is better than Lilian, he is better than Ritochika, and at least in the case of Mei Lin specifically, Scarlet just doesn't give enough of an increase to really justify using her over Douglas. You can see here 1.6% and not even 1%. So I wanted to try and make this one a little bit more educational. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Anyway, that's going to be it from me today. Let me know what you guys think in the comments and what other things you'd like to see the numbers for. Maybe you want to see other partners being compared, other characters being compared, let me know. With that being said, I'll see you all next time. Stay safe.